Hey, Michael.
Hey, Diane, good to see you after a few episodes diving deep into school models and thinking all about AI and what it enables today.
Indeed, we are going to shift gears a bit today, not away from AI, because based on all the emails, the calls, the feedback we're getting, this is the thing folks are thinking about and talking about. And so we're sticking with AI. Rather, we're going to shift away from AI school models, full school models, and infrastructure to how AI is being used directly by and with teachers and students and in classrooms. And so I think this is going to be a really, interesting other dimension of what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we thought this was the next logical place to go. Everyone says if you're not changing the classroom at some point, you're not changing much. And so we wanted to go into that classroom and explore how a small number of folks, entrepreneurs, are thinking about really how do we use AI in classrooms without the entire school itself or the system around it being changed. And so this is I'm really excited for this conversation. Someone we've both known for a long time and get to go deeper on it, Diane.
A very long time. I'm really excited today to welcome Matt Pasternak to the conversation. I was trying to think about when we met, Matt, but it feels like so long ago. I can't even remember at this point, because you actually were early at School to One, which is now, Teach to One as a director of assessment. And then you went and you were on the founding team of Clever, which many people will know as a tool that effectively connected ed tech products to student information systems. So this really critical infrastructure piece that enabled so much of what we now sort of take for granted in terms of technology. And then now, most recently, you're the founder and CEO of Once, which is a company that leverages. Well, I'm going to say what I think it is, and then we're going to get into it. You're going to really describe it for us. A company that leverages the research around tutoring by using reading based software, and human people to teach 3 to 7 year olds to read. And so we're just grateful to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here. I've known you both for quite some time, and it's really an honor to be on the show.
Well, we're thrilled you're making the time for us. So let's dig into it. As Diane mentioned, you are working on solving a problem that we've talked about on this podcast historically, which is teaching reading, something that there's a lot of evidence around how to do. But as Diane said, before tackling this reading challenge, you helped build Clever, and it does feel like a big shift from, if you will, school infrastructure to teaching, learning, curriculum. Maybe it's back to your roots in some sense from School of One, but tell us about the origin story of Once and your own personal why for building it.
Sure, sure. Well, I'll share two things. One is that, very early in my ed tech career, before Clever, I worked on some projects that were very, very expansive in what they tried to accomplish, and both on the data infrastructure side as well as on the curriculum side. And it was sort of the heady days of the late, aughts or early 2000s, and then the early 2010s, excuse me. And sort of this belief, if you just sprinkled a little bit of technology or software magic on things, education, everything would just work. And there were these, really exciting analogies to Netflix's personalization. I'm sure you remember those days. And so I spent some time trying to boil the ocean. And then after that, I kind of made an abrupt turn and never looked back. And I said, look, I want to work on specific problems in education. And the first one was what Clever tackled, and it was an area I had a lot of insight into from some of those earlier explorations on, the specific problems that rostering and single sign-on presented to schools, and particularly schools trying to adopt software in varying ways. After Clever, I kind of went in a little bit of a different direction for a while, focused on voting, and then in the sort of early to mid pandemic, I was catching up with an old friend of mine who had been a teacher in the same school where I taught after college, and we were talking about how during the early pandemic, both of our kids who are kindergarten age were out of school because schools shut down. And yet both of them learned to read in that year out of school. Now my wife is a former kindergarten teacher, and so I was like, oh, I had an unfair advantage. I mean, she had sort of one-on-one tutoring from a kindergarten teacher, missing kindergarten. But my close friend was a former middle school teacher, and it's not like he had been working on that expertise forever. But he said, yeah, structured 15-minute lessons every day. His child learned to read, and we just sort of stepped back for a minute and said, wait, for as long as anyone can remember, we've been teaching kids to read, attempting to teach kids to read in these sort of 30-person classrooms. And you know the numbers in sort of any education environment, about half of kids, if given some of the right foundation, will learn to read to some extent. And so any teacher can look at their progress and say, well, some of my kids are learning to read, it's working. But if you want all of your kids to learn to read, you can't say that what's happening today is working because we have flat NAEP, we've had flat NAEP scores for decades. And so we just started to kind of think really big picture and say, what would happen if every kindergartner got the education that our two kids had gotten in the early pandemic, which is just 15 minutes a day of one-on-one reading instruction. And initially, we actually wanted to avoid schools, avoid K to 12. We said, look, the sort of sales process in K to 12 is so complicated. Let's do something different. Let's actually focus on preschool because research was just coming out about how early the brain starts developing for where children begin, learning, are able to learn to interpret written language. And then as we started to explore the preschool route, we realized that that was probably even harder than K-12. And so we kind of returned to our roots and started in a charter school. Actually, was our first implementation, and basically just said, hey, can we put a couple people in the back of this TK classroom and teach, have them provide daily one-on-one tutoring to the students to help them learn how to read. And we had some amazing success stories. And it was just a couple-month pilot. There was a child who came to school every day, lots of home context, crying and kind of hiding under his desk, and did not want to be in school. And it still makes me kind of emotional to tell the story. But even a month or two in, he was sort of opening up to school and responding to school, and people asked him, what had changed, and he said it was the one-on-one tutoring he was getting every single day.
Wow.
And that's a 5-year-old who that's going to determine the
Yeah.
next, the rest of his life essentially.
Wow.
And so we kind of took that and said, and the folks who were providing the tutoring had not had background as reading tutors. That was really important to us because we said there just aren't enough kind of trained reading specialists in the country to do this at a scale of 4 million kids a year. So you need a
Right.
method that allows any adult to access this material and provide this instruction. And then we had this really interesting call with actually Portland Public Schools. And this was kind of right after right as that pilot was winding down. And we were talking to them, and they said, well, we can't afford to, sort of put all these other people, pay you to bring all these other people into schools and teach kids how to read. We don't even know where you'd source them. But they said, look, we have tons of instructional assistants. That was a position that they had at the time, who are supposed to be working on reading in the early grades. Could we use this type of program with them? And that was kind of our light bulb moment because we said, look, we're not an HR company, right? We have no expertise in how do you hire tens of thousands of tutors all over the country to provide this instruction. We attempted it in some pilots and literally were like unable to source even like a couple tutors in some metropolitan areas. And so we said we want to work with the staff the school already has, and that really that conversation launched everything. We did not win that deal. We did not end up serving Portland Public Schools. It was okay. That learning that they gave us in that phone call was worth its weight in gold, and I'll always be grateful to them for that experience and taking the time with us
That's
at
awesome.
that early stage in our journey.
Matt, I love that we're gonna get sprinkled into this conversation, this bonus of just what it's like to try to build something and sell to schools and whatnot. So that's really fun to hear that piece. listening to your origin story, um, people might be saying, wait a minute, you're spending this season talking about AI and education, but it doesn't seem like once is related to technology even or AI. And in fact, you began if, in that pandemic period. So before the sort of famous release of ChatGPT in November 2022. And so, you know, as a guy who at face value seems to have been tech forward, what was your sort of original hypothesis and approach to making sure, to just sort of going what it seems like full human approach to reading? And is there technology in here anywhere?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think there's a two-part answer there. The first is that one thing we were certain of from day one was that young children learn best from adults, like actual in-person, human-to-human instruction. For millions of years, our species and the predecessor of our species have been, teaching children to identify different berries and, what animals going to hurt them and which ones are safe and how to survive, and that was all done, millions of years of evolution for in-person communication between an adult and a child, where the child was highly motivated to learn because the stakes were life and death, and sort of the idea that you would deviate away from that just sort of seems somewhat crazy on its face to us. So that was the motivation for, you need to build trusting relationships with adults, and technology is scalable in a way that people sometimes aren't. So how can we apply technology, but let's do it in a way that deepens that connection and doesn't attempt to replace the connection or build a kind of robot teacher. The other piece of this was that I've had the privilege in my career. I'm not a software engineer, but I've had the privilege to work with some very, very, very incredible software engineers. And what I've often noticed is that when you start working with some of these folks, the first thing they'll say is, hey, let's build a version of this product in Google Slides or Google Docs or Google Sheets. Like, let's build something that's throwaway, but that we can learn from, because we're going to waste too much time. This is a little bit before the days of vibe coding, but we'll waste too much time kind of coding something up. Like, let's be really, really lean in terms of how we want to model what we want to accomplish. And so our perspective at the beginning was, that's what we want to do. We literally started in, Google Slides and Google Sheets were essentially our technology. And, funders who were interested in tech stuff basically ignored us because we weren't very technical. But the one thing we said we were going to do from day one is we wanted to record every single instructional session that was given. So even though we're talking about like recordings on Google Meet, we sort of knew where things were going. I mean, yes, you hadn't had these massive releases of OpenAI and various things, but AI was in the air, the late teens, it was in the air. Folks knew where this was going. Technology was going to fundamentally change. And we just had this belief that if you had, hundreds of thousands, millions of hours of recordings of adults teaching kids to read, even if you had no other technology, that you could then, one day run software over that archive and begin to do things that others would say, oh my gosh, I wish I had this, sort of
Yeah.
database, but I don't. So I think those were kind of the two key decisions and motivations for that early, less technical beginning.
Well, so let me actually jump in there then, Matt. Let's fast forward us, right, to where you are now, right? So you're not going to be an HR solution. You say we're not in that business. You have all these recordings. What does once look like today? What does it do? How's it maybe similar, different from, those initial put aside the very early pilots, but once you sort of got on the ground and running, tell us how
Yeah.
it's evolved from that.
Yeah. So what we do today is we serve sort of two different audiences. We serve school districts and we actually serve parents at home. And so I can kind of talk about those a little bit in turn. But what we do, I'll start with school districts. In school districts, we solve two interlinked problems. One problem that we solve is that there are too many kids in school districts who have not effectively learned how to read. And sometimes I think the best evidence of that is when you have, middle schools or high schools saying, hey, we figured out what we have to do differently. We have to start really emphasizing phonics in seventh and eighth grade or high school. It's like, on the one hand, great, kids who haven't learned that do need to learn it. But that's the evidence of an enormous problem because there's really kind of 1 to 2 years of phonics to learn. And if you've had 9 years of schooling and that's the set of activities, that just indicates, excuse me, that indicates just a huge miss basically in the early grades. So one problem is reading, and the other problem is a lack of career ladder for entry level staff in schools, which is also a really important problem because schools are having tremendous challenges finding enough a large enough teaching staff to teach the children in school. And so we said, let's solve both those problems at once by providing coaching and curriculum to elementary school support staff, paraprofessionals, teaching assistants, instructional assistants. There's a number of different roles, as long as they're not lead classroom teacher, because then they have to oversee 20 or 30 kids. By providing curriculum and coaching to those folks, we can upskill them to the point where anyone can provide one-on-one tutoring daily for 15 minutes to, kindergartners is where we focus. We do some TK in first grade, but kindergarten's where we focus, provide 15 minutes of daily instruction to those children. And what this looks like, kind of from a technology perspective, because again, we started very low tech, we are a software solution today. And what this looks like is the child and the paraprofessional sit down side by side in front of an open laptop computer. We call it, we teach the paras how to build a one desk classroom. So they have their desk and it's all set up with the physical materials they need and their laptop computer. And they sit right there. A ton of work has gone into that organization. And on the screen on one part of the screen is what the child's looking at. On the other part of the screen is the script for the adult. And the adult is basically going through the script, and the child is responding to the script and looking at their part of the screen and going through a number of different, science of reading based exercises and tasks that teach the child how to read. And the adult is using, a fair amount of judgment in there as well, identifying when are children saying things the wrong way, when are they saying things the right way, how do you keep children motivated through this process? But the kind of focus is what's happening on the screen. And then we record those sessions and we provide coaching. We have a national team of coaches who then watch those recordings and provide feedback to the paraprofessionals about how to improve, essentially how to improve their instruction. Like you're basically watching game tape of yourself and using that to improve your instructional techniques. So that's sort of a big piece of what we do.
Super interesting, Matt. Can you, so you're starting in this very low tech way with these Google spreadsheets and slides and, basically prototyping what you're going to do. And if I remember correctly, you were videoing and then literally like doing training calls with those folks, like, oh, we watch your video and let's coach you up on this essentially. And now that's a much more seamless software experience as you just described. Take us to that moment where AI becomes the reality and you've made this really smart bet and you have all these recordings. How does AI figure in here? And we're trying to be really thoughtful. We've recognized that people use the word AI or whatever that is, acronym AI, to describe almost everything, right? Like this massive range. So the specificity is super helpful of like how you actually use it here and what role it has played.
So we use it in a couple ways. All of our AI is behind the scenes. So there's, this is not a chatbot. This is not, either the paraprofessional asking a quick question, wait, how do I do this? Or obviously the student doing that because, they couldn't use a chatbot. They don't know how to type yet. It's all behind the scenes. One key way that it's used is we are able to administer oral reading fluency tests very, very frequently on the students because we're capturing the full session. And so then we have all the data, the speech data, the transcript data from that session. And so we can go and we can evaluate oral reading fluency. in a typical classroom, elementary school classroom, if they use some, assessment like Dibbles, the teacher might do three oral reading fluency assessments during the year. Once the beginning, the middle, and the end. Each one takes roughly a month because the teacher has to like pull each kid aside one-on-one and administer this test. And so it's like 3 months, of instruction to some extent are spent not providing instruction, but performing these tests. And that's just that's not the best use of teachers' time. And so simply by just having all of the kids individually learning on camera, we're able to run these tests in the background and we have results, every 2 weeks. So that's a really important use of AI. Again, the parents may have no idea that AI is even involved in that. And that's great. Like this is not, sort of that Gemini sparkle in the corner. This is just like, no, it's actually just making the experience seamless. The next thing that we do is we're huge fans of what's called connected phonation. Again, if I'm going too deep into details of literacy, let me know. But basically, a lot in some systems, even sort of science of reading, evidence-based systems, there's a lot of focus on kind of tapping out individual sounds. So if I want to say the word bat, it would be the b sound, the a sound, the t sound. And when you teach a child, like, oh, you just sort of say b, at, and it's like, well, that's bat. Like that doesn't sound like bat. It sounds like at. It sounds like these sort of disconnected sounds. And you can, that is again one way that people teach it. But I think the more modern approach that University of Florida and others have really emphasized is connected phonation. So you're not, if a B and an A come sequentially, you're going to teach a child to go like that B is kind of quick sound, and then they're going to go right into that long A sound, and they're always going to do that when they see those sounds in sequence. They're going to connect those sounds. Well, not only do we have audio of what's happening in the lesson, but we also have little sliders underneath the words, and so a child can move the slider while they're saying the word, and we can use AI to really notice things about is the child's finger actually tracking what they're saying? How much are they connecting? Are they pausing in the right places? Because some kids, maybe they know the word bat, so they just want to jump in and say it really fast. Well, that's great for that word, but you don't then learn the fundamental skills that will help you read much more complex words. So, evaluating something like how quickly does a child's finger move on the screen is another beautiful application of AI. And then, really for us, the last one, it seems sort of obvious, but it's just using AI to write code. And it's just, we are able to move 10 times as fast as, on sort of 10x fewer resources as we would be able to otherwise, kind of before this moment in time. And so, that's, we wouldn't be able to do what we do without, AI assisting in development. What I'll say sort of one level deeper is, where does it go from here? Is it just these sort of fluency tests and, kind of tracking fingers on the screen? Um, you know, as we progress, you can really use AI to evaluate, student fluency in real time, right? How did they just pronounce that word that was just said? This is a much harder technical problem than it sounds like, because while the tech world has made huge advances in interpreting adult speech, where you basically try and eliminate the errors to turn some garbled thing an adult says into something intelligible. With kids, you want the opposite. You actually want to figure out which of those sounds when they pronounce that word was incorrect. Rather than automated speech recognition, you want automated phoneme recognition. And if you ask, folks who are really deep in that world, everyone will admit we don't have good automated phoneme recognition today. It's just not there yet. But we have, again, the video archives that will let us build towards that. So we're very, very excited about that. You can also begin to use AI to connect, reading many folks regard as multiple strands. So there's comprehension, there's phonics, there's phonemic awareness, there's these different elements of it. And so how is a child progressing on these different strands? And how does progress on one strand kind of influence what you would want to teach them next? So really that sort of learning engineering. And then the final piece, just to kind of fill out the story, is a lot of folks will tell you, I've heard on your episodes before, that 90% of learning is motivation. 10% of the technology, the curriculum, but most of it is really the motivation. We have, if you want to learn between YouTube and all the different educational apps out there, like there's never been a better time in history to learn, and yet we see essentially flat performance over the decades. Well, one way to motivate both learners, but even more importantly, their teachers, is to show them a highlight reel of like what's gone really well. Well, it is prohibitively expensive for us to, manually curate a highlight reel of every session of instruction. But if, a parent has taught 10 kids and at the end of that day or 20 kids, they get to say, hey, here's a 30-second recap of like your best aha moments during the day. I am coming in tomorrow. I'm not going to call it sick. I'm not going to do anything else. Like I'm going to do it and I'm going to kind of push those kids as far as I can take them. And so that might be the most magical application of AI at all. Not even kind of automated phoneme recognition, but just literally highlight reels of the incredible instruction we're seeing.
That's fascinating because we've had several conversations about motivation here, and I personally have felt kind of unsatisfied about those conversations. So this actually seems like a really amazing use of the technology related to motivation. Let me ask you about something that comes up, I think, a lot in the reading conversations, dare I say, the reading wars, which
Mhm.
is this idea that kids need to be reading things that they're interested in and that they care about and that they're those sorts of things. When you're in this early stage of teaching reading, are you personalizing what the kids are reading at all? Does that matter? Is technology supporting that? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are definitely keeping an eye on the ability of AI to generate what we would call, or what many people in the sort of industry would call decodables, which are texts that students are able to decode. A lot of times things are called decodables that actually aren't decodable to the student. So one thing that's really interesting about reading is that, you might think, well, if a kid, if they can read 75% of the words, like that's probably good enough. Like that's better than not, being able to read 10% of the words or something. But actually comprehension often requires like being able to read 90 to 95% of the words. So if you want to build decodable text, like there is not really a margin for error. You need to make sure that kids are reading texts with words that they are able to decode. Doesn't mean they've memorized those words. I'm not talking about sight words, but they're able to decode those words. And the challenge of reading English, not true of all languages, but English, is that, a single letter can have many different sounds depending on what other letters are around it and kind of how it's positioned. And so if you just tell a computer, build stories using this letter or using, this sequence of letters, it will often inadvertently pull in the wrong,
Mhm.
pull in the words that the kid isn't able to code. Well, if it pulls in one of those, maybe that's okay. They can figure out from context. But if you've got, a page with 15 words and five of them aren't decodable, like this decodable is not decodable. And that's where kids can lose motivation. So it's like deeply interlaced with this concept of motivation. So we're keeping an eye on it. We don't think it's quite there yet at the age that we're working at. I know some people are working in higher grade levels, and I don't have the expertise there. But in the kind of 3 to 6 year old grade level, we are very very carefully still hand curating stories at this point.
It's fascinating, Matt, because as you alluded to, there's this huge conversation around can you level reading, and some of that is directed at particular publishers that tried to do it in a way that was not related to decodables, and some of it is just a broader conversation. And I'm taking some new information away from this conversation, so I appreciate that. Let me shift though, rather than go too deep in that, because one of the other things that you're doing, I think, is pushing on how AI can start to redefine the role of the educator themselves, right? In some
Yes.
ways, you have AI, it seems, making sure that they stick to what's the evidence around how to, teach reading the best, right? So that we're not getting too far ahead of ourselves or freelancing in ways that may be detrimental. And then you're also deferring to judgment, it seems, for the educator, right, around that motivation piece and what they're seeing on the ground with the kid in ways that you just, you can't pick up with technology today. Help us understand that shift over the time around, what you think that reading coach ultimately is, and that split between technology, the human judgment, and how that gets
Yeah.
redefined. And maybe we make it easier, frankly, or more people can be great reading coaches in the future.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. Our vision is that any adult, and by adult, I'll actually broaden to older teenagers, are able to teach children how to read. And I think if you look, we sometimes cite a stat that 95% of kids are taught the ABCs by their parents or guardians, right? It's like parents and guardians, they're trying to do the right thing. They just don't know what to do. Like teaching a child the ABCs, for a couple kids will teach them to read. For almost all other kids, it will not teach them to read. And so they're motivated. They know how important this is. They don't know what to do. So we want any adult. Doesn't matter if English is your second language. It doesn't matter, if you've struggled to read yourself. Like we want to empower any adult to be able to teach any child. Now, you do sometimes there are conflicts where do I want to give the adult who's delivering the instruction more autonomy so they can kind of grow more in their career, or I want to remove a little judgment and make it a little more scripted. And I think over time you'll see dials in our system where you can kind of dial it up and down either way. Because once you get to the point where it's just the computer speaking, well, now you're back to just computer education with an adult patiently sitting there. That's not how kids learn to distinguish berries, right? Like we've gone too far. So the adult needs to be really, really involved in that teaching, but understanding their capacity and what they feel like, sort of, because it's not just reading a script. It's, the hardest thing in teaching reading is what do you do when a kid makes a mistake, right? Like we have a whole sort of flow chart, a whole approach we take when a child makes a mistake decoding, and being able to implement something like that is hard. And so software can help. Our biggest innovation kind of in this regard, which is something that we've just started to roll out recently, is no longer restricting this actual teaching to paraprofessionals or instructional assistants or existing support staff at the school, but actually broadening that circle to older high school students. That's where I sort of hinted at teenagers. And we've just gotten started here. So we are learning as much as they are. But I've seen some pictures and I've seen some videos of a high school student sitting down next to a kindergartner, teaching them to read with the little kindergartner just eyes full of adoration. This is not a teacher. This is someone who they deeply look up to as an older kid who actually cares about them. And it is so inspiring. And if we had a world where, our high school students could knock out, reading specialization for a large number of our kindergartners, I mean, I think it would change it.
Generational impact would be
I
huge.
mean, yeah, when you called me with this idea, Matt, like I haven't stopped thinking about it since, because I think that this is the type of thinking that we need in education right now, because this checks so many boxes. I mean, not only are we putting multi-age groups together and learning, right? But we are giving, let's talk about the impact on the high school student here, who feels a sense of worth and purpose, and is actually doing an early job, gaining real experience, coaching and developing person. Who knows where that could possibly lead? And then you have this brilliant idea of enabling them to be entrepreneurial. Like imagine a neighborhood where teenagers in the summer sort of have the once tool, and they can open their own little neighborhood business teaching kids to read in the summer. Like I love this so much for so many reasons. It's really brilliant. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I mean, we are, again, we're learning so much right now, but the response, I mentioned, I kind of joked earlier about, selling to school districts and how hard that was. And I mean, it really is every entrepreneur's challenge in K-12. There are these magic moments when school districts don't become hard to sell to. It's really hard to find those products. Like it is extremely hard. Clever was one of them, right? I mean, Clever just blossomed across the country, and it was so exciting to see, sort of help it spread and kind of watch the spread, and it was something very special. What we are not operating at Clever velocity right now in terms of distribution, but we have gotten such an outpouring of response. Superintendents who write in saying, I get a million cold emails a day. I don't read any of them, but when I saw high school CTE students teaching kindergartners how to read, I was like, oh, that's it. That's so obviously it. And we're hearing that response. One thing that's so exciting, to date, we've primarily focused on kind of top 500 districts. It's very large districts. A lot of them are urban, but these very big school districts. And we are getting this response from tiny districts, also from some large ones, but from tiny ones, from, rural districts, from districts that can't really afford to have paraprofessionals, but they've got high school CTE students and they're looking
Yeah.
for a great thing for them to do. And they've got kindergartners who aren't learning how to read. And it's like, let's go, and that is just amazing. And so we are flying to, towns across the US right now that, we've never heard their names before, and just being embraced by the folks who are there, and just going right in. It's wonderful.
That's so cool. I mean, I think about the leadership opportunities, responsibility, judgment, just like it's checks so
Yeah,
many boxes.
yeah.
And then again, the generational impact, if you do that at scale, could be
Mm,
humongous.
Mm.
Let's wrap up with this last question, which is before we go to our what you've been reading and watching outside of work thing. But look, once as you just talked about, is designed to be facilitated by could be an instructional aide, parapro, high school student, whatever. It's not a whole class curriculum, right? And
mm,
so you talked about those magic moments where districts actually start to absorb it and so forth. But take us into the classroom itself. How
yeah,
are schools putting once into their schedules and days? How are they integrating it? What's the
yeah.
impact it's having about how they think about the whole class activities that they perhaps have been doing? Are there trade-offs that they're having to make? Help us understand, where does it lock into the current schedule?
It's a great question. It's like the fundamental question to making tutoring work. I mean, a lot of the leading tutoring researchers have said tutoring is fundamentally a question of logistics. Anyone, so many providers have great training and many have great coaching and various things. Like, can you get the logistics right or can you not? And so we go very, very deep with our school district partners. We have, a world class, we call them our program team, and they go in and they work because it is not like there are not district wide answers to how you solve that question. You cannot go
Mm.
to, XYZ public schools with 100 schools and say, okay, we're going to do once during these blocks in this space in the school. Because every school has slightly different requirements, different spaces, different people. It's all different. And so we go school by school. We help them map out a schedule. Will this instruction happen in the back of the classroom? Will it happen in a little annex room that's right near the classroom? Does it happen in the hallway if the hallways are quiet? Often in elementary schools they are. It just sort of, again, depends very much on that school. Oh, here was this space that was used for teachers to congregate, but teachers aren't actually congregating there. Or, the lunchroom is actually empty from 8 to 10 a.m. every day. That's an unused space. Like, let's take advantage of that. So, we have, worked with so many schools by this point. We just have thought through all these different permutations. And so we sit down with the schools, school by school, come up with a customized solution for each one. And, the challenging part, if you're listening to this, is that sounds hard and expensive. And, and it is, I don't want to minimize, like, that is, that slows down scale a little bit when you have to kind of do hard things. On the flip side, we have never come across a school that can't do this. So sometimes you have a solution that says, oh, well, when we rewrite the language of schooling, when we completely change, what schools look like and how they're structured and what the day is, then that will unlock AI and unlock everything. And then kids can finally learn. And, if you've been around schools for a long time, I think many of us would be pessimistic that you're going to see rapid changes in those dimensions anytime soon at scale. And so we're really proud of the fact that, we can go into any school district, any school building, and we will find a way to build up the schedules. And the neat thing, again, about the application of technology, in our earlier days, we, back in the kind of Google Meet and Google Sheets days, it took so much training and coaching on how to make those very lightweight technical tools work that realistically, someone giving instruction could only give it to, would have to give it to at least 10 or 15 or 20 kids, because the investment you put in and
Yes.
teaching them the ropes made
Yeah.
it just wasn't worthwhile to teach a single kid. But as
Mhm.
we've amped up our software and amped up this use of AI, we can realize this vision. You have high school kids coming in and doing it. The school secretary, does she have a free 15 minutes or 30 minutes? That's two kids right there. In many schools, the principals say, hey, I don't want to just administer this. I want to work with the very hard, not hardest, most difficult kindergartner, the most challenged kindergartner, the one who maybe has, home circumstances that are the most challenging, or, who has a learning difference, or for some reason is really struggling in the classroom, I want to take that kid under my wing as a school principal, and I want to teach that kid to read, and I want the school to see that like I'm teaching that kid to read, and it goes a little bit back to, you sort of think of Steve Jobs would always look, he'd go into Apple devices and he'd look at the wiring configurations, in the background, like the things customers could never see. And he'd say, if the wires are messy in the back, then it shows that we don't actually care about what we're building, and we're never going to build good stuff, even though
Mm,
customers would never see that. And I think it's that attention to detail. And, historically, principals maybe are really strict about kids lining up, or really strict about like certain small details that then create that school culture. Well, here's another detail that shows,
yeah.
my focus is on the kid, and it's really beautiful to watch.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for that. In early elementary school, I mean, Michael and I have talked about this often. Like, we are hard pressed to think of something more important than that happens in
Yeah,
early elementary school than
yeah.
literally every child learns to read. And so, I'm glad to hear that people are doing what's necessary, and that it's totally they understand that it's totally possible to organize school in a way that every child will learn to read. That feels so critical. So thanks for the inspiring story of what you're doing, and the connection between the humans and the AI. Really, really fun. And so now, of course, Michael and I are very curious to hear what you are personally reading or listening to or watching outside of your work. We try to stay outside of our work. We break our rule often, but if there's something that you have to share, we'd love to hear it.
Oh, well, no, I'm happy to. Actually, yeah, I feel like for many years between, raising kids and having intense jobs, I really didn't find much time to read other than, sort of the newspaper, things like that. But I have recently joined some book clubs and gotten back into reading, which feels great, and I cherish it. I'm currently in the middle of Demon Copperhead. I don't know
Oh,
if
yeah.
you've read that, but I the first part was so depressing. It just, it's lightly based on Dickens, and it just felt like, oh my God, like just kind of going down that hole. And it was a little challenging to get through. And now things have turned around a little bit. So I haven't finished it. I'm excited to see what happens, but I've been
Awesome.
having I've been having a lot of fun with it. And then for watching, I just got to watch. I watched Alex Honnold's Ascent of the Taipei Building on Netflix,
Very
which was
cool.
very fun. I watched it after it was over, so I knew at the beginning that he was going to stay safe. But I got to watch it while running on a treadmill, which is a really fun experience. I'm not sure I've ever been able to push myself that hard. It's like, well, this guy's doing something much harder, so I can at least run fast. So that was enjoyable.
That's awesome. Well, Michael, and folks who've listened for a long time will know that when I tell you we're preparing for a trip to Morocco and southern Spain, that means that I've got a combo fiction and nonfiction reading list that I'm working through, because that is sort of how we do vacationing. And on this one, I'm digging into sort of religion, culture, history that is not very familiar to me. So it's been a fun learning journey. I'm grateful to Gemini, who is my study buddy for this one, and is actually such an incredibly useful tool for these purposes. At the moment, I've got three books going. So, one is called Dreams of Trespass, Tales of a Harem Girlhood by Fatima Marisi. Sorry, butchered that one. And it's not what you think. I'm learning a ton. It's actually quite an interesting feminist
Hmm.
story. And then two others. So Islam by Karen Armstrong and No God But God by Reza Aslan. And those are really interesting, different perspectives on the religion that I'm sort of reading side by side with each other. So super fun.
Very cool. Very exciting. I always love when you share these, Diane, because as listeners also know, you've changed my own practice around travel to start to do this habit as well. And Matt, I liked your Dickens reference because it connects in an odd way for the one that I'm going to do, which is, as Diane knows, I don't read a ton of fiction, but I actually finished a fiction book here, In the Shadow of the Greenbrier, by Emily Matchar. I'm probably also bungling her last name, but I picked it up. Honestly, I was at synagogue. I saw it in the temple library, and Greenbrier was a place that we used to vacation with my grandparents and my cousins a few times growing up over Christmas. And so I was sort of curious. And it's like this intergenerational Jewish sort of mystery story, if you will, trying to piece together different puzzle pieces. And the Greenbrier is sort of the central part of it. But the only reason I say that, Matt, is I remember one of the years that we vacationed at the Greenbrier, they had like the foremost Charles Dickens expert or something like that in residence. And he gave lectures,
Oh, great.
which we, as 12 or 13-year-olds, dutifully attended, and I think did not cut up too much during, which was impressive for us. But so I feel like I'm connecting on a bunch of these things at the moment, but it was a fun read. And Diane, one of the reasons I don't read a lot of fiction, I forgot, is because when I read it, I don't put it down and I become a bit of a zombie
Yes.
around the house for
Yep.
a couple of days. So
Yep.
Totally.
Yep.
yeah, so it's
There
just
is
dangerous.
such thing as binge reading, just like binge watching, right?
Exactly. And nonfiction, while I love it and I read it a lot, turns out it doesn't do that for me. Whereas fiction, I'm a lost cause around the house. So
The secret is just simultaneously reading it on the Kindle and Audible, and then you can volunteer. Hey, I'll go do the dishes. You just put in your headset,
exactly,
and
plug it in and power
you
through.
keep going. You keep going right, right where you were. So
So
Good
great.
tip. Good power tip. All right. Huge thank you, Matt, for joining us. And again, to all of the listeners who keep coming in with all sorts of feedback, both positive notes, questions. We like those, and then some of the hate mail too. We love it all because we learn a ton. And just keep it coming off this conversation. We look forward to more, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Class Disrupted.